for this opportunity to speak with you and to share some thoughts about what a feminist foreign policy looks like. As Prabha said, I am Sahana Dharmapuri. I'm the director of Our Secure Future. It's the Women, Peace, and Security Initiative at a foundation in Colorado called One Earth Future Foundation. And our foundation, the vision of our foundation is to achieve peace through governance. And we have a very long-term view of that. We're interested in governance systems and structures that undermine political violence. And at Our Secure Future, our actual whole title is Our Secure Future, Women Make the Difference. At Our Secure Future, we believe that the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is actually one of those crucial governance frameworks that will undermine and is already undermining political violence through gender equality. And that's a crucial point of this. We all know, surprise, surprise, that we live on the planet and it's made up of mostly men and women, right? Like there's men and women that live together, and we have to figure out how to not only get along, but to steward our life together. So, but we are facing a lot of challenges today, and we have to ask, what is a foreign policy for, just in general, right? I'm not just talking about a feminist foreign policy, but what is a foreign policy for? And it's usually, used to advance national interests internationally, to manage state relations. It's used to address problems like these that I'm showing you on the screen of climate change, of refugee issues, of, we have increasing violent extremism, et cetera, around the world. But it is really to preserve national security and peace and security globally, right? And to maintain the balance of power. So when we talk about what is a feminist foreign policy, what does that look like, given that that's the framework we're working with? So I chose a slide, and it's still from the Wonder Woman movie. And if any of you are familiar with Wonder Woman, they live on an island of women, right? There's no men, it's all governed by women. Is this what a feminist foreign policy is aiming for? No. And I can even base that on research. There is a researcher who reviewed several hundred peace negotiations and found that in all of the negotiations that women were present in as a non-state actor group at the negotiating table, at no time did any of those non-state actor groups made up of women, ask for their own territory. What they asked for was to support state sovereignty. They asked for institutions of human rights. They asked for security sector reform and education and the new architecture of the new state. So I think that that's actually a really important point when we talk about when we use the word feminist and foreign policy together, because it is based on gender equality, right? So, and we also know that from a growing body of research, and this is just one of the most, one of the most recent and very powerful pieces of research by Valerie Hudson and her team. And there's all kinds of research, right? There's quantitative, there's qualitative, there's participatory research, but this particular book, Sex and World Peace, and this work by Valerie Hudson is very persuasive with the policy audience because she did a lot of regressions and quantitative analysis and found that the best predictor of states' behavior and peacefulness is actually the treatment of the women citizens in the country. So if we have this research and we have this understanding that we're not talking about privileging a few over others, we're not talking about creating a whole other territory or country just for women, what is a feminist foreign policy? What makes it different? So I'm going to talk about three things. What it is, where it comes from, and how to do it. And before I get there, I want to just plant a few seeds in your mind. There's three key reasons why a feminist foreign policy is unlike any other foreign policy that has come before it. And that it's, well, and even before that, I would like to just echo what Prabha was saying, is that it is, in my view, it is not aspirational, something that is already happening, and we have the frameworks for it. And it has a definite historical and legal grounding. So what are the three things that make it really unlike anything that's ever happened before? One is it originates from a global constituency of non-state actors. It does not originate, this idea of feminist foreign policy does not originate from one state. It actually originates from a global movement of women-led organizations working on the idea of gender equality and proliferating that idea. Two, it uses and actually requires nonviolent, human rights-based approaches to security. And then three, the heart of it is about gender equality, equality between men and women as intrinsic to international peace and security. So this, when I'm saying, actually all rests on the historical and legal precedence of it and grounding of it, rests on global mandates on women, peace, and security that are embedded into international peace architecture today. Probably many of you on the call are aware of UN 1325, that it was passed in the year 2000. But since then, there have been many other resolutions, which I think there's 8 here on the screen. And the key aspect of this resolution at the Security Council level, which has now permeated throughout state behavior and state practice, regionally and domestically, is the idea of women's participation and using a gender analysis or gender perspective to understand peace and security challenges that people are faced with. And I just wanted, I put on the slide there that the US, since I'm talking from the US, we have adopted a national action plan in 2011 that was adopted under an executive order under President Obama, and then it was updated in 2016, last summer. And right now, the US Congress is considering passing a bill on the Women, Peace, and Security Act, which would provide legislation and more support to actually implement the ideas and the guidance of increasing women's full participation and gender perspective within defense, diplomacy, and development operations. So what we think of feminist foreign policy today, I'm sure that you all are aware of Margaret Wallström's announcement in 2014, and then the action plan they came out with in 2015 of Sweden has the first ever feminist foreign policy and what that meant to her. The United Kingdom in 2014 actually initiated a big program with their international development funds to focus specifically on women's rights and girls' rights in international development programming. This past June, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Canada announced a major funding shift for 95% of their foreign aid, Canada's foreign aid, will be focused on women and girls' rights around the world. But I wanted to say that that all comes from, those are nice announcements and political gestures, but I wanted to also underscore that today we have about 67 countries that have adopted national action plans on women, peace, and security. And those are not government initiated. Those are always initiated from local civil society, right? To work in a participatory engagement process with the different ministries of government. So that's the first time ever in our history of humankind that we actually have 67 states that have peace plans. That's what national action plans on women, peace, and security are. They are actually peace plans, and they affect all the different ministries or agencies of the government structure, and they require commitments. Now, is it the best? Are they all funded? Are they actually being fully implemented? That's another question, right? Those are the challenges that we're facing, is how are we moving from these pronouncements and these statements to actually getting it implemented, getting the right kind of budget behind it, really challenging gender bias within institutions to move the agenda forward. But my point here is, let's look at the international peace architecture and the legal and policy frameworks and commitments that states have made globally. There are regional action plans for women, peace, and security. The African Union has an action plan on women, peace, and security. The EU has a strategy on women, peace, and security. NATO and the UN both have very specific policy directives that they are implementing throughout all of their theaters of operations and peace support and peace and security operations. Are they doing it well? No, they could be doing it better. But my point here is, let's talk about the international architecture that exists and what are we building on and what can we use to advance this agenda forward, and how much we are actually, with the structure in place, how much support we actually do have to really implement and operationalize this idea of the feminist foreign policy of advancing gender equality and peace and security. So a few other legal and policy frameworks that include, that are included in this agenda are the international, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international humanitarian law. And I wanted to make a note about the Arms Trade Treaty that was passed in 2013, which is another really great example of this, that when those negotiations were happening, UN 1325 was considered in part of those negotiations, and it's the first arms trade treaty that actually includes gender-based language, that it requires a gender analysis by state actors when they review the sale of arms and where is it going. Now, again, I have to say, who is going to do that review? Who is going to do the gender analysis? Who has the responsibility of carrying that out? Where is the money for that? Those are questions that we should be asking, right? But we should know, we should start from up here and understand that we have all of this behind us. We have all these policy frameworks and this activity happening at an international policy and legal commitment level, and that is going to be able to support us to push forward an agenda. So I wanted to say that based on these global mandates and these actions, although it's very easy to say, to translate for the public that a feminist foreign policy is about women and girls' rights, because that is what you've seen in the Swedish or the Canadian or UK approach, that this is about empowering women and girls, or this is about addressing sexual violence and gender-based violence, primarily directed at women and girls. Actually, that is not the core. When you look at the global mandates, that is not the core of a feminist foreign policy. The heart of a feminist foreign policy is actually gender equality, equality between men and women. And the hand of it, the how you do it, is the gender perspective. And I guarantee you, when you do your gender analysis and your gender perspective, 99% of the time, the answer will be to address the inequities in women's rights and girls' rights, right? I'm not saying that women's rights and girls' rights are not important, right? But I think this is a very key and important distinction as we move forward, and for the broader movement to understand how to really be successful at implementing this and not keep us in a box of this is just a women's issue. No, this is pervasive. Gender equality is transformative, and it will transform and already is transforming how security is being thought of and done. And I wanted to go back to this word of feminism and the gift. What is the gift of feminism to political science, really, in this framework of a feminist foreign policy? And I wanted to relate this story to you because I think it's very important for our understanding of why we're focused on gender equality and a gender perspective. This is a picture by, it's a painting by John Collier of one of the priestesses of, in Greek mythology. And it reminds me of a story of King Croesus of Lydia. He wanted to wage war against the Persians. So he went to the oracle at Delphi and he asked her, if I wage this war, will it be won? And she says, if this war is waged, a great empire will be destroyed. So he goes back and he fights the Persians and he loses. And so he questions, well, did she lie to me? Why did she give me the wrong information? And the oracle says, well, actually, Cyrus, the king of the Persians, really takes pity on Croesus when he hears the story. So he actually calls the oracle in front of both of them. So why did you lie to him and have him fight against me? And she says, actually, I didn't lie. You didn't ask the right question and you misinterpreted the information I gave you. And to me, that is the gift of feminism, is actually asking the right question, having the perspective, the right perspective on the problems that are facing us, right? And that is where a gender perspective or gender analysis comes in. That allows us, this nuanced social power analysis tool allows us to ask the right questions and to use a different way of looking at and evaluating not only the problem, but our solutions to transform that problem, because we're looking at it in terms of inequalities and moving towards equality. So I just put a couple of definitions up here of a gender perspective and what that looks like, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with this term and probably even in your work doing it, right? That perspective is supposed to help us understand how men and women, boys and girls are impacted by our policies, programs, decisions, but also help us understand how their experiences and their perspectives and needs impact the decisions that we make. So very interestingly in this, there's a feedback loop within this social power analysis, unlike other types of analysis where it's unidirectional, right? So why did I put the story of 1325 here? Where did all of this come from? It came from people like you, women-led organizations who were working all over the world, who had no money, no power, no territory. They certainly didn't have an army, but they were able to mobilize and influence the highest level of security decision-making, that body in the world, right, through 1325. This is where that uniqueness of feminist foreign policy agenda coming from a global constituency of non-state actors is rooted in, because those women living in those conflict zones went to the Security Council and said, what you're doing in peace negotiations, in peacekeeping, in your program development, it's not working. And let us tell you why it's not working. It's because there is no gender perspective. You are not consulting with women. You are not having dialogues. You are not using a human rights-based approach. And so when you look at the resolution 1325, there are 18 points in that resolution. And it's pretty much the kitchen sink of resolutions. It includes everything. It's not just about peace negotiation. It is including transitional justice, disarmament and reintegration, refugee issues, disaster relief, reconstruction, prevention of conflict. Today, that translates, into those 8 resolutions I showed you before. That means that it includes the problems we're facing today with climate change and countering violent extremism, to actually include the voices of these and experiences of these women-led social justice groups into the highest level of security decision-making. That is the intent of it. And I think that's a really important aspect of where and how the feminist foreign policy agenda is different than any other agenda. But what does that mean in practice? How are we going to operationalize this? How are we going to make this a reality? So I just put a few pictures up here. It'll be interesting in the question and answers to hear what you all have to say about it. But here are some ways that it is being operationalized today. There are more consultations with women by the hard security sector with the civil society, right, to inform their decision-making process. There is more recognition of women, of the importance of women's participation in decision-making at all levels. But what happens in that is, that challenge is that people tend to focus on the numbers of women and women's representation versus having the gender perspective and the gender analysis informing those decisions that security actors or political actors are making. And then you have an increasing focus on female peacekeepers and an increasing number of female peacekeepers, although that number is also still quite low. But all of this is to say that the crucial part of this is that the structures are changing, but this is not about token representation. Based on the frameworks that I talked about earlier, those policy frameworks and agenda present and actually are transforming the structures inside of these institutions to include positions such as a gender advisor, a military gender advisor who advises the force commander, female peacekeepers who are, it might be an all-female force, but they are still an integral part of the peacekeeping mission, and they perform duties and report throughout the chain of command the information that they've gathered and present that analysis. But also military gender advisors can be, unlike female peacekeepers, military gender advisors can be men or women officers. They don't have to be women. They're trained in how to use a gender analysis. They're trained in how to operationalize that throughout, say, a peace and security operation. And then the picture below is a picture of actually some of the women on the UN Women's Advisory Board that we're seeing more and more visibility and push for women to be advising and involved in security decision-making and peace decision-making. Although the barriers are definitely still there, I think the important part of this is that we have the structure and then there's growing visibility. Whether or not we're focusing on the right things sometimes, like maybe we focus too much on women's representation and not enough on how to actually change the structure and the way that we're doing the security is another step in the evolution, I think, of executing a feminist foreign policy. So the point is that we're doing things today. And I wanted to share this quote with you because it shows, we have so much resistance, I think, from people who are hard security actors, who people don't consider themselves feminists and think that it's an emotional kind of radical movement. But this quote is very interesting by this brigadier and former force commander who actually used this quote in talking to the people he was commanding and saying that understanding the role of women, having this gender perspective is very important assessment of what security and stability needs in that area. What does it take to create a stable environment? We have to include these questions in the way that we think about security. So I think that in itself, that if we are now influencing this level of security decision maker in the way that he or she thinks about security, that is a huge step forward, and it is a way that the feminist foreign policy is advancing kind of step by step within institutions that may not necessarily be visible on the outside, right, of those institutions. So here's another question for you. So William Hague, the UK, said the great strategic prize for the 21st century is the full empowerment of women, right? But he also lumped in sexual violence as an impediment to achieving that goal. And I do agree that sexual violence and violence against women is one of the most obvious symptoms of inequality in society. I think the strategic prize, I would rephrase his statement as saying, the greatest strategic prize for the 21st century is actually achieving equality between men and women, right? And that actually right now, the way that people are talking about the women, peace, and security agenda and gender equality and gender perspective, how you do that is as a strategic capability for hard security actors and hard security thinkers. So if you put your hard security hat on, right, this is the language that they understand is operational effectiveness. How does it improve what I'm doing? Well, guess what? The toolbox that we're presenting as feminists, as proponents of women, peace, and security agenda are really different. This is not deterrence and compellence. This is dialogue, consultation, human rights-based approaches, dealing with communities directly, understanding what human security is versus how to use a tank and a gun, right? It is about transparency and participation. Particularly, we see that happening in the fact that there's a growing number of national action plans, because those national action plans could not happen without civil society actors working with state institutions to produce those plans, right? That in itself, that type of participatory engagement is new, has never happened before, and is increasing transparency and participation. I will also step back and say, is it perfect? No. Are we at the beginning? Yes. This is an emerging trend, but we are doing these things. And the fact that people who think of themselves as hard security actors, who will use the language of foreign policy to say, this foreign policy is, we are supposed to be acting in our national interests, right? We are supposed to be advancing our national goals. We're supposed to be protecting our national interests and state territory. These people can understand what a strategic capability is. And they can start understanding how these things that I'm showing you are part of that toolbox to enhance their effectiveness in reaching national interest goals, right? And that in itself, that conversation itself, that exposure to the way women civil society groups are working on the ground and thinking about these issues is actually changing the way security actors think and define security, right? So I wanted to just recap that a feminist foreign policy, it's emerging. It is based on real and existing, very strong policy and legal commitments by the international community. It is different than any other foreign policy agenda that's ever come before it, particularly because it comes from a global constituency of non-state actors, right? And it's centered on a non-violent human rights-based approach to security and peace decision-making. That is where the dialogue and consultation and gender perspectives come in, right? And thirdly, as I said before, the heart of it is about gender equality. Equality between men and women is considered intrinsic to achieving lasting peace. And we know that based on the growing body of research, right? Growing body of evidence that is showing us both quantitatively and on the ground that when we take these actions and we include women and we increase women's representation and we pay attention to gender equality and we use a gender perspective, it actually improves everything that we're doing. So it is not aspirational, actually. When those big pronouncements come out from different governments, the reason why Margaret Wallström can say have feminist foreign policy is that because it lands on all of the policy frameworks, the resolutions, and the work that women have done. That's why you can have that statement of we want a feminist foreign policy. But I also want to say something that we did a study just recently, we just completed a study on engaging male leaders and male champions of women, peace, and security. And one of the men said, listen, people can try to stop this or hinder it or create obstacles for this agenda to move forward. But the thing is, in bureaucracies and institutions, it's much more difficult to take something out than it is to put something in. And these frameworks and these policies and the fact that they're being implemented so and operationalized so intrinsic into the daily work of these institutions is showing that it's getting embedded. It's getting embedded slowly over time, institutionally, right? So I am kind of the person who's like people say glass half full or glass half empty. I've been accused of the glass is like overflowing. That's what I see. So what I'm seeing is that this isn't a trend. a very positive trend in the face of a lot of things that we're facing around the world. This is a reality. It's not going to go away. It's not aspirational. It's not something somebody can just cross a line out and say, okay, it doesn't exist anymore because it doesn't have a budget, or, you know, we're not interested. This is a global movement and now is entrenched in state behavior and state practice. So it is not aspirational. We are all actually part of it and doing it today. And I think it's critical that we understand that we're part of it, that everything that we do advances a feminist foreign policy agenda. It's not up to a state actor to make a big pronouncement, because that's not what got us here anyway, right? So I just wanted to end with this. You're probably wondering what this is. I just moved to Colorado a year ago, and people out here are very athletic, and you see people bicycling around a lot. I'm not a professional athlete, but there's a lot of people out here who are. And I learned this term, draft legal, and this is a picture of it. It's basically when some of the fastest riders go out in front, they pick up speed, they're ahead of the pack. What happens is they create a wind pocket behind them, and other riders can come up behind them and fill in that wind pocket. And as a group, they end up going much faster. They end up picking up momentum that they could not have and a speed that they could not have alone. And I feel like that is a great analogy for where we are right now. That the policies and frameworks that we talked about, those were the people who were the leaders. They were ahead, they were pedaling way farther down the line than any of us. We're coming now into that wind pocket that they have created for us. We're slowly coming into that, and we're picking up momentum. And I really believe that the more people come in and understand this, the faster we'll go and the more momentum we're going to pick up together. And then just ending on, where is this going? What's the vision for it? I feel like we're on this path. And there's a poem by Antonio Machado, which probably most of you know, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, which he says, "Walker, there is no road, you make the road as you go on it." And I think that that is exactly what we're doing. This is a feminist foreign policy is a creative process. It is something that started with the initiative and wisdom and the courage of many, many women who decided to challenge power. And just as I said, the gift of feminism is to ask the questions why, to challenge power and to challenge its structure. And we're on that path. And we just have to keep walking down the path and create it as we go, and not look to others to tell us what it should be like and what it should look like, because we're the ones creating it. So I will end with that and just say thank you. I hope I didn't talk too fast. I wanted to get in a lot of information really quickly, and I'm happy to go over and answer any questions that you have.
Oh, that was... Oh my goodness!
That was amazing.
What a richness! I'm just pausing and hoping that we get a few seconds to take in everything that you've talked about. Mm-hmm. And Riham, since you're typing, I'm guessing you cannot speak for whatever reason. Is that right? Please feel free to speak now. There are a couple of comments that came in very quickly, and
yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not able to see the chat, so you're going to have to read it out.
She's driving in Cairo traffic jam, so that could be hard.
Okay. So Riham, just so you know, Riham El Jabbali works for the Ministry of Education and has been she's been one of the International Training Institute participants and has been very actively engaged in a variety of efforts, including around this agenda. I'm sorry, somebody's trying to call me. But she's been saying that she likes the idea of engaging men, leaders and champions in the women's peace and security process. And thank you. It's really fruitful. I'm driving in Cairo traffic jam. So.
No, thank you. I'll be safe.
Exactly. Others. So if you want to stop sharing, you might be able to see the others.
Yeah,
I
just had a little problem with my cursor. That my computer is acting funny. So you might be seeing a couple of different things here.
I had a question. This is
Please.
Karen. Is there a repository of all of the various action plans? How can we get more information on some of the specifics and how to participate maybe in some of the strategies?
Sure. Yes, peacewomen.org has all of the action plans there, and they keep very good track of all the new ones that are coming out and ones that are being under discussion right now. So they have the latest and the greatest. You can very easily find them by just Googling Peace Women or 1325 National Action Plans, but it's definitely www.peacewomen.org. And it will tell you which countries are actually not only have adopted national action plans, but which ones have who are considering and are under discussion or negotiation to create them. So that's also a really, I think, important time to get involved is when the discussions are happening. And also, actually, I should say, we created on our website, on our Secure Future, a map of national action plans, and we list the, if you click over the country, it should show you the organizations that are involved in the participatory process of the plan, and we should be able to link onto the national action plan as well.
Oh, okay. That's on your website also, Sahana?
Yeah, it's on our website under projects.
Under projects, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, here we go. So for those of you who are looking for it, there are several places that you can find this, but here it is on our Secure Futures website also.
Yeah, thanks.
So how to use the National Action Plan. So related to Karen's question about National Action Plans, they are now also under the Sustainable Development Goals. Isn't there a new term for the review of these plans, the review process? We've actually gone through the first review of some of these national action plans, and each year there are countries reviewing them, aren't there, to update them?
Well, every year, so member states are required to have national action plans, but it's been a very slow process for countries to adopt them. For example, the U.S., like UN 1325 was passed in the year 2000. The U.S. didn't adopt a national action plan on women, peace, and security until 2011, right? They're pretty late to the game. So, but then in terms of reviewing, it's really the country itself that reviews and goes, with this participatory engagement process with civil society, the foreign ministry, the defense ministry, the other agencies. They review it together and decide what their priorities are and their objectives are, and update the plan. There are, member states have made commitments. In the year 2015, it was the 15th anniversary of 1325, so many countries made commitments at the UN and UNGA to say what they were going to do to advance. Oh, sorry about that, that's my, my email. We're going to advance their national action plans. And some member states committed money, some people, like Spain said, we're going to create a network of women, peace, and security focal points. And we're going to convene a conference, a global conference of those women, peace, and security focal points so everyone can meet together and have a peer network and support each other. And I think that happens next year. But then other countries have more just internal goals that they decide that they're going to commit to and try to do. It's different for every country. But the SDG 16 on peace, sustainable peace, I forgot exactly, strengthening peace networks or governance networks, I think is the most directly related to the work of 1325, even though there is, it's goal 5 or 6 is on gender equality as well. Yeah.
Any other thoughts, questions? I just want to say, for me, as you're all thinking about your questions, what you've done a wonderful job of is capturing and giving those of us who are constantly facing questions about what a feminist agenda means, very practical language. This is exactly what it means. It's not about the images that one might have. It's not about, it's not a zero-sum game. It is really one in which everybody gets the benefit because of the perspective that you're sharing with all of us. And I think that is a huge benefit. And I see us really making this a part of our International Training Institute core part of the curriculum so people understand it, and making a connection to, because many of them are serving on committees in their countries for their national action plans. But I think knowing that there is an infrastructure that they can plug into, that there is a network in their countries that they can plug into and sort of add to the wind pocket, I love that analogy, is a great piece of information too. So, others?
I also think that, aside from knowing that you have these different things happening in your own country, I find it, if you're sitting alone in a meeting, like one of those pictures I showed you is of all those men, I was actually sitting in the corner talking to all those guys. And it's very helpful to be able to walk in there and say, hey, I'm not just telling you this is a nice thing to do. And it's just that it's my opinion, and this, and it makes you feel good, right? Because a lot of times I think those government actors know and feel that it is the right thing to do, and they want to do it, but they feel like it's a personal agenda. And I think what's really important is to actually educate them and to tell them, listen, this is not a personal agenda. This is not a personal opinion. This is grounded in all the legal and policy frameworks that you are already obligated to. You are already working on these things, and it includes this, right? And if you don't do this, then you're not doing what you're supposed to do, and you're not being effective at what your responsibilities are, right? So it's both there are national action plans and civil society committees and people working on these issues in the country, but it's also really important for each of us to understand that this is not about a personal agenda or a nice thing to do, right? That this is actually something that we are required to do, that is part of our job to do, and that there's a way to do it. It's not just, okay, I'm now required to include women, so I will just invite them to the March 8th International Day event, right? That's a good way to include women, and I think that is what's been happening for a long time, right? A lot of tokenism. But to be able to say, no, the way you actually do this is by using a gender perspective in your work, by using a gender analysis in your work. So if you are consulting with the State Department and they want to do a security assessment of Syria, they have to have somebody on their team who has the ability to do a gender analysis or an assessment and integrate it into that security assessment. Because the recommendations coming back from that security assessment will be gender blind if you don't, right? And there's great examples, like from Ambassador Don Steinberg tells a story about when he was ambassador to Angola and he was negotiating the peace agreement there. He said that he was trying to be gender neutral, and there was in no place in the agreement did it mention men or women. But then when they started the transition process, he realized he was very wrong because they didn't include a gender assessment in the demining of agricultural areas and roads. And what he said happened was that all these women who came back to their villages who were starting to grow food again were the ones that were the most deeply affected by this landmine problem, because they didn't include in the agreement that this gender perspective of who's walking on the roads, who are the agricultural workers, who's going to really be in their daily work dealing with this land and this territory to address the landmine issue. And so he said he learned the hard way of you can't be gender neutral. You can only be gender blind or gender aware. And the gender blindness definitely makes us ineffective.
Great story. Lisa, were you going to ask a question? So you're on mute. You're on mute.
No, it's so interesting. I think it's that gender blindness does make us unaware. And I found everything that you said so, to echo Prabha, very rich in content. I don't have a contextual question. Actually, and timing for the NATO conference, are you? How is some of these? Are we going to be addressing some of this integration? More examples of, for example, the military gender advisor, or other kinds of actions that have happened since we've named the position to get more awareness of the chain of command and any sorts of issues in the reconciliation, or more awareness in the countries where this is happening? Is there any sort of metric that's going to be maybe instituted, or how's that going to go? I think that's it.
Yeah. So a little bit of background. So on NATO, they adopted their policy in 2009, and then shortly thereafter, they not only wrote the policy, but I helped to work with them on developing the training for what does a gender military advisor do, what does a gender military field advisor do, and what does a gender military focal point do. And those are all positions that are strategically in alignment with the chain of command. So the gender military advisor reports at the strategic level to the force commander. So it's at the very top level, and is in line with those other high-level military advisors, like the political advisor or something, right? Would sit very close to the force commander. Then the gender military field advisor is at the operational level, where you have all the different branches of a theater of operation, like the intelligence and the medic branch and the other legal branch or whatever, right? That all things that are operationalizing, those offices that operationalize the mission. And then below that, you have the tactical level, right? And that's where you have the people, the men and women who actually go out and do work. They actually go out and do the patrols. They interact with the local population, right? So those people, there would be somebody assigned at that level for like 15, 20% of their job to be gender focal point, right? And they report up. So they're at the bottom, they're doing patrols. They report then up to the gender field advisor, who takes that information, spreads it across the branches of intelligence, medic, legal, blah, blah, blah. And then those reports go also up to the gender military advisor, who reports to the force commander, right? And so what that has done, and these are not, so the challenge here with militaries, and NATO obviously is a family, right, of countries. It's not just one. And and similar to the UN, it's when they do this peace operations or peace support operations, they are a mix of different countries serving together, and they have one organizational structure, so that even though you're from a different country, you are still in this chain of command and reporting to, right, whoever's the force commander, and following the structure. So it has been instituted, and people are doing it, and they are reporting on it, but the stories that I know are classified because that's information internal to the mission. They won't necessarily tell other people. So I can tell you one story that's in a sort of anecdotal way of what it looked like on the ground. Starting more generally. So for example, we know the patrols will go out every day to see how is the security, in a certain area. And as that quote from that force commander I showed you earlier said, it's really important to understand women's roles. So, one of the recommendations might be from the gender field advisor to the focal points is, well, today when you do your patrol, don't go down the main market road. When you map out the route, where is the women's market? Instead of going straight down this way, take a left and go down to the women's market. And the gender military advisor and field advisor might actually make up the patrol cards, which are the questions that the soldiers get in the morning at their briefing, and they put in the pocket of their pants, and then when they walk around, those are the 2 questions or 3 questions that they're just talk, and they ask people, local population, what's happening, how are you feeling, right? And the gender field advisor and gender military advisor can actually write those questions and help advise, like, ask the girls and boys, are they going to school, or what are the conditions like, or is the market going to be open today? Because we know that women typically, if there is a sign of violence or rumors of violence, an early warning sign is that the markets are going to be closed because women will not walk there, right? And so the gender advisors are basically integrating that information into the daily work of the people who are in those operations on the ground. Then they use that patrol card, ask those questions, report back up the chain and say, well, this is what it looks like. This is what people are telling us. That gets into the work of the operations, and that goes into the reporting to the force commander and understanding of, are we being effective or not in our operation? What is actually happening on the ground? I think, the U.S. does not, I know for sure the U.S. does not have the structure change of gender military advisor or gender field advisor. They have instituted instead something that's called female engagement teams, which are Marines, female soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that is very different. And this is another key point. That is why I go back to, this is not about, you can't understand women for a feminist foreign policy as just about women, because that will exclude us, and it will actually ghettoize the whole issue of gender equality and the transformation that we're talking about, because we've seen that in international development for the last 40 years, right? So in the case of female engagement teams with Marines, the people in the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan noticed that they needed women to help do the searches or to talk to the local women, because it was very gender divided society. And that's the way they started. They did not start with the basis of understanding, hey, there is a women, peace, and security framework. There are these legal commitments. There are these resolutions. There are these mandates that we have to do. They just did it out of necessity because they knew it works. Now you have to put those 2 things together, right? So that those female engagement teams are not so disconnected from the policy framework and the obligations that we have, because their efforts are then a one-off project. It's very easy to say, well, we tried that and it was necessary in Afghanistan, but that's not going to work in China because we don't have the same problem in China, right? And that's why you have to rely on the operationalizing and the institutionalizing of the frameworks that we have, instead of presenting it as just women's rights, because you will always get the pushback of like, well, that context is different than this context, and that culture is different than that culture, and their culture is different than our culture. But that's the key to gender, right? That gender is about social construction of behavior and identity, and it changes from place to place and over time. Nothing ever stays the same, particularly in conflict. That's some of the greatest opportunities for women to advance, right? Because the roles are shifting and changing, and there's much more opportunity for public space. So I think, again, like, what you said before, Prabha, about when people go to these things or try to explain what this is about, it's good to have support, actual support of a network in country and people that you can talk to, but it's equally important for people to understand why, and to talk about why these policy frameworks and legal commitments of their countries are, that they exist, right? And that this is the foundation of the actions you're taking. So, one thing I do in training with military people is I show them a picture of a woman. It's kind of an old picture of it's from an African conflict. And the woman is walking with a machine gun, and she has some food on her head, and she doesn't have a shirt on, and she's walking through, and she's carrying something else, like maybe some water or whatever. And she's walking through a swampy area by herself. And I asked them, who is this woman? Who is this? And, usually they start to say like, oh, she's like a very strong woman, or maybe she's a mother, she must be carrying, you know, a baby or something, or maybe she's a refugee, or maybe somebody, you know, maybe she's trying to protect herself. And I said, okay, well, that's, you know, there's all one way to look at it. I said, well, what if she's a combatant? Why don't we think about her as a combatant? She's carrying a machine gun. Or an ex-combatant. Is she a non-state actor? Is she part of the rebel group? Like, we need to start reframing the way that we're, in the language we attach to the way that we look at women. So I don't want to minimize the conversation about women's rights, but I do want to elevate that conversation about gender equality and a gender perspective. And using the same language that they use for them to understand, you know, that we're not talking about a different problem here. It's not a problem, it's a priority issue. So.
And that, as you said, there is a rich toolbox that has been developed to provide substantive support and a framework that exists. That in itself is enormously powerful. I want to do, it's a few minutes after the hour. I'd like to do a quick go around and see if all of you who are on the call can give Sahana one takeaway that you have from this presentation. That would be really helpful. What stood out for you? Okay, so I'm going to read something from Richard because he said his connection is unstable. Can you please forward a question? Okay, how would this gender sensitivity of such gender field officers intersect with the cultural context of any place, assuming that there is no single homogeneous version of these issues? Does it in any way have an imposition of Western ideas upon different actors? So, just a question from Richard. Richard, are you from Nepal or Bangladesh? I forget. But that's a question I often get, that this is a Western gendered perspective, and I have an answer, but I want to hear yours.
Oh, okay. Should I answer? Okay.
Better, I'm sure.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, first of all, the whole women, peace, and security agenda, which I talked about before, is actually completely non-Western. It came from women in non-Western countries. Bangladesh, Guatemala, Tanzania, I'm trying to think of some of the other countries that were predominantly represented. But so first of all, the agenda itself comes from women in non-Western conflict zones. Second of all, gender sensitivity and doing a gender analysis is doing a critical social analysis. You are not applying your opinion or your view about human rights. You are asking some basic questions. In this area that I'm operating in, who has access and control of resources? What are the practices and beliefs of men and women here, right? What are what's the legal status and role of men and women here, right? What is expected of young boys and of young girls here, right? You're asking those questions. Actually, that is what gender sensitivity is a heightened awareness and heightened sensitivity to the power dynamics and the social and economic political dynamics of the people in that area. And you're asking those questions not alone. It's a participatory process. You actually have to ask and observe from those women and boys and men and girls in the community, what is their experience? What are their needs? What are their priorities? What are their values? So it is not driven by a Western agenda or perspective. It is a social analysis tool, like any other social analysis, critical thinking skill or tool set that you would use to analyze a security problem or a social or power analysis. And I also would say that many times what you want to do is you'd like to have a woman or a man from the community do the gender analysis. You don't want to necessarily have somebody from outside the community do it, right? But either way, it is a participatory process, and it is an analytical skill, right? That basically analytical skill is, kind of devoid of political opinion. So you're doing analysis of the power structure, and that's going to look different wherever you are. So, for example, we asked all these men, these male leaders, we had opinions about what we were seeing about male leaders and how what they were challenged with and how they were facing things or what they were doing. But we thought, well, nobody's actually asked them what they think about this agenda and how do they advance it? What's their experience? And actually, that was one of the number one things that came up in those interviews we did with about 75 men who were from all over. They were from civil society groups globally, from the UN, from US Department of State and DOD and military. And a lot of them said, this is the first time anybody's ever asked me why I champion gender equality. I have never actually had to tell anyone, or I've never actually had a conversation like this before. Nobody's asked me what I thought about it. And so in that regard, it was sort of kind of the flip side of this question that you're asking is who gets left out of the conversation, right?
And the key here is that this is a perspective, like many of our processes that we practice, it's based on asking the right questions. I mean, I love that what you started with is this feminist agenda, foreign policy is about what it has led to is increased dialogue and consultation. How often do we hear that? So that is the linchpin, and I think every conflict transformation practitioner should be jumping all over this because they have the skills. And that's why I think this is so meaningful for us as practitioners, that it is a foreign policy that is well developed, rooted in civil society engagement and advocacy, and has a wind pocket. Let's add to it, folks. All right. Who else? Hello, Cinda.
Hi. So I'm Cinda Collins-Arsenault, and as a board member of One Earth Future, I just wanted to say how proud I am of Sahana and how it just completely reinforces why we're doing this work and the important role that we have. So thank you, Sahana.
Thank you, Cinda.
Thank you.
Prabha, as a man listening in, I feel this has been a great session for me to help me begin to move from gender equality blindness, I think that was the term you used, to awareness and sensitivity. I leave events, moments like this, excited and energized about doing something. The question is, what can I/we do to join with you? Someone chatted, we need men involved. So I guess I quickly think, well, I'd like to invite others into the conversation, especially men, using racism ideas to educate others, to school ourselves, to participate publicly, to speak up, practice empathy for this. But I guess I'm really asking the question because I don't want to go away today feeling better informed and then forget that I was here.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really great question, and it's really interesting because it echoes something that we heard a lot from the male leaders that we interviewed. One thing we noticed was that even though they felt excited and committed to the idea of gender equality and wanting to do more, when we said, well, what do you think are some program strategies, or have you talked to other men, other peers? And they said, no, we haven't talked to our peers about this, male peers. And even though we do programs addressing masculinities, like in a fatherhood project, or family planning, or boyhood masculinity and stuff, in programs in other countries, we haven't ever thought of applying some of those same practices to male leaders in these institutions of power. And myself and my colleague Jillian thought that was really interesting. Well, we thought, well, a really low-hanging fruit is to actually do exactly what you said. Invite other men into this conversation about gender equality. We have heard many reasons why it's difficult for men to participate. One is, even if they are champions of gender equality, they feel so heightened, so sensitive to the issue that they don't want to take over women's space. They're not sure that it would be okay. Is it politically correct? They want to join in the conversation, but they don't want to be the person out in front and dominating. And all of that, to me, all of those answers that we got from people showed that there's a real shift happening in men's roles, and that men are not quite sure what kind of role they can play, because the role that they usually have had is to be out in front and to lead. But one thing that men haven't been doing is talking to each other about this, and maybe not even talking about it in terms of like a, you know, an objective or work issue, but just like, this is the problem I faced in my team, like between the men and the women, or this is the, I'm looking at this issue and I don't know how to make it more effective. I was thinking that gender perspective or analysis could work. Have you ever tried that before? Or, you know, I think men, from what we've seen, is even if they're, this is a real story. I interviewed like 60 men for another study on peacekeeping at the UN, and it turned out there was a couple of people who were serving in the same mission in the Congo, and they overlapped and they were friends, and one was the chief of mission, one was force commander, one was somebody else on staff. And individually in the interviews, they all told me very similar story of the challenges they had internally with gender bias, but also the effectiveness that they saw happening with including a gender perspective, and, you know, female, or, you know, roles of female interpreters were very positive, whatever. When in the second interview, I realized, with the second person, I realized, oh my gosh, they all know each other. And so I asked, I went back to them separately and I asked, did you ever speak to any of your colleagues about this? And they said, oh no, you know, I thought it was my responsibility, and I tried to manage it the best that I could in my team, right? And this is what I saw in my team. And I didn't tell the other people that I had talked to the others, right? But I knew that they all knew each other. I knew they were all there at the same time. I knew they were all talking about the same problem. And yet, even though they were friends, they never, and colleagues, and they worked together, they never shared that challenge, that information, and they didn't treat it like a competency in their work. So I think, like, as you said, finding ways, how do we invite men into this conversation and understand the roles are shifting? What does it look like for men to be in a supporting role? What does it look like for men who have positions of power to use that power in a supporting role, in an influential role, to perhaps turn gender bias on its head by using their influence to advance this agenda without, you know, and I think in the beginning, as I said, we're on this path and we've never done this before. So in the beginning, some people's toes are going to get stepped on. But I think the important thing is to, let's just try everything. Like, we haven't tried. Let's just see, you know, what would it look like if you did have another webinar, like, and really try, like, on a feminist foreign policy, but really try to get more of the male membership on the conversation, to say, well, you know, have it really be a conversation. What is it? I mean, is it difficult for you? I guess I'm asking you the question. Is it difficult for you to bring up a feminist foreign policy? Like, how do people respond to you if you bring it up versus if your colleague who's a woman brings it up, right? I think those things are really worth talking about right now. So I don't know, I hope that was helpful, but I guess the one recommendation is, like, yes, have a conversation. Yes, and have it with one person, have it with 3 people, have it with 5 people, right?
That's what I'm going to do. Thank you.
Awesome.
Right. Courtney, you're going to lead one of the women's peace tables at the October gathering. And as an added testament to what Sahana is talking about, we had a participant at ITI in Jakarta. He was the youth leader for one of the, I forget if it was Shan State or Kachin State Army in Myanmar. And he came to the session, and he and another person, there were three men out of the 25 participants. And at the end of that, he said, you know, I have tried to do this, and I finally have language, and I understand what I need to do as a leader. And so for him, it was extraordinarily empowering. He went back and trained 9,000 people. I mean, I thought, that is fantastic. That's all. That's what leadership means. I mean, not male or female, but just leadership where he has power, knows it, gathers the tools, and then shares it. It's enormously empowering. Anyway, so others, Karen, Richard, no. So Richard says, the question was well answered. The takeaway for me was the participatory process that remains integral to the question of gender. Riham, there is 854, somebody's on the phone, and then there is an Afsane. So if any of you, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but if any of you would like to say something, clearly nobody's going away. We usually schedule it for an hour. This is
well, it's very kind of you to stay. I enjoyed the conversation as well. It's helpful to talk about these things out loud too.
This is Karen. I have a question because feminist is such a loaded word. I was just reading an article about Angela Merkel, and she was speaking to a group, and they asked who was a feminist, and she did not raise her hand. And because of all the baggage, and what you're really talking about are very subtle changes, but they pack such a wallop into what clicks into the mindset when you're using certain words. So I had a question about the choice of feminist. And then the other thing that I was reminded of when you were talking about the military and security issues, it's been a couple of years since I thought of this, so I hope I'm remembering the acronym correctly, but I think it's either the Marines or the Air Force who train soldiers who are going into enemy combat areas on doing a process called the OODA loop. And it's OODA, and I think it's is observe, orient, decide, and act. And the way the training is put forth is that this is to keep you safe, because you are, it's usually like the advanced scouts or something that are going into enemy territory. And part of the observe and orient is all about understanding the perspective and where you are, noticing the differences, taking into account how that enemy is going to act based on their culture, their perspective, and everything. And it's really teaching soldiers how to empathize in order to keep them alive and in a combat area. And so it's such a nice way to do it, because I think so many people knee-jerk into a reaction. Oh, it's the feminist thing, or it's the, you know, the feminine ID politics kind of thing. And this is such a neutral thing, but it's purely a security thing. And it incorporates that empathizing perspective and how it's essential in really understanding how to be effective and how to implement strategic policies. And so your presentation really just reminded me of that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So yeah, I completely agree with, you know, being able to talk, okay, well, for your first question about feminists, using the term feminist, it is loaded, but I also think, why should we, if a feminist means that it's about equality for men and women, then I have no problem with that. That is what I am a feminist. That is what I believe, and it's not hurting anyone, and it's not taking away from anyone. In fact, it actually is a position of changing your mindset about what power is. Instead of using power over other people, can we use our power collectively for the benefit for everyone? And that's what I think of the goal of equality between men and women is, what we strive for. So I think it's unfortunate that women in leadership positions don't want to call themselves feminists, even though sure a lot of their behavior and their belief system do champion gender equality, right? I mean, gender equality is basically rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a democratic ideal. We're talking about human rights, basically, right? So, but I do understand that there are different generations who understand and have experienced feminism differently. And I also, and I'm going to say this, it sounds humorous, and I mean, it feels humorous. To me, it's kind of funny, but I know it's not funny. But I often think, you know, when I compare the conversation between radical, or not even radical, but feminists who are considered, oh my gosh, they're radical, they're bra burning, all these angry women, right? To the conversation about terrorists today, extremists today, it sounds like the same rhetoric. They're radicals, they're, you know, extreme. But if we think about what got that name for feminists, for women who call themselves feminist and radical, it was a bunch of women standing outside of a political convention one time in the US and burning their bras, their own underwear, right, in a garbage can. They didn't blow up the building. They didn't hurt anybody else. They didn't, you know, stockpile weapons. And as I said before, they never asked for their own country. They asked for state sovereignty, right? They asked for state sovereignty to respect the rights of its citizens. They asked for state sovereignty to enforce itself in terms of its responsibility to its citizens. So I find it ironic that we have the same emotional resistance to feminists that we do because we use the same language about terrorists and their radical belief system. And I think that that's just gender bias. And gender bias, as I said, I see the glass overflowing. So I think, you know, gender is something that changes over time from place to place in a second, because it doesn't cost money for someone to change the way that they think, right? It's just a new perspective that they're seeing. And so the other thing that you said, Karen, about the training, the UDA training, you know, I didn't want my presentation to be like so military security heavy. So I left out this language that was actually in the COIN manual, the counterinsurgency manual that was used by the US in Afghanistan. We have, you know, a chapter about how to do assessments on the ground. And guess what? It doesn't use the word gender, but it walks you through the same exact power analysis, the exact steps of power analysis, without asking, though, for sex disaggregated data, without asking specifically, because if you don't do sex disaggregated data and you do the power analysis, you still just get people, right? Or you get political factions. You don't get that more nuanced and comprehensive information about everybody in the picture, right? And so they were definitely onto something, but without having a gender perspective and asking, well, what are the women doing? What are the men doing? Right? Why are the women doing that? Why are the men doing that? Going back to our, you know, oral selfie, like, we need to ask the right questions, right? You can observe, but if we're not asking who's doing what, where are the women, who's included, who's not, then we're missing a lot of the picture. And often I tell the speakers, you can make these decisions without a gender analysis and without sex disaggregated data, because you have been, but you're wasting a lot of money because you're not coming up with the right answers. You only have half the information if you only talk to half the population. So I don't know if that helps, Karen, in terms of like adding the UDA training and the COIN training, just being able to reframe the things they're already doing and to say, oh, it's great that you're doing that, but you could do it even better if you asked this question, where are the women, and collect sex disaggregated data. And then they understand it's not, you're not asking them to invest millions of dollars into like a whole new system they have to learn, right? Although, in my opinion, I don't see why they shouldn't invest in put in a lot of money in training, because it would still be a fraction of the money that they invest in military, right? If we did this kind of training versus that kind of training. So I hope that is a interesting response.
Wonderful. All right, we have time for one final comment from any of the participants. I think we have asked their questions and spoken. Thank you again, Sahana. I want to express how appreciative I am for the time and what you've taken to doing the presentation. I hope the conversation was as rich for you as it was for all of us listening.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone for taking the time to Zoom in, and yeah, I love the conversation. Thank you for all the questions, and thanks for the opportunity to share some of these ideas with you. I'm happy to answer other questions. People can email me if they like, or take a look at our site, and really interesting to continue the conversation.
That's right. There's a lot of material on our secure future. I'm glad to send it out to all of the participants. The one other question that came from someone was about a gender analysis toolbox. Do you have any good resources for people who might want to get trained in gender analysis?
So there's there's this simple way to do it, and then there's more intensive trainings. I would, if you want to do a training, I would recommend, there's a group in Canada called Mosaic that does gender training, and they're very good. It is, I think, about a 5-day training. I also, a shorter version, or it's not really training, but just to let you know, I have written some blog posts on our site that is called Back to Basics. That gives some questions, but I mean, basically, if you ask the question, if you have a brief in front of you, or you're going into a country that you are working with, if you just ask the question, how are men and women differently impacted by the situation because of their different roles in society? Ask that question first. And then the second one is, how is what I'm doing differently impacted because of men and women's different roles and power relations and needs in society? And you can take those questions with you in your back pocket anywhere you go. You can always ask that. And then to do an extensive one, there's a good book that Carolyn Moser produced with some other editors many years ago, and it might be available online in a PDF for free now. It's just outlines the different gender analysis frameworks, and there's about 7 or 8, and you can use it at like the household level, or developing program level, or you can look at it from a national level to look at policies. But I mean, basic rules of thumb is collect sex disaggregated data and ask, how are men and women differently impacted by the situation because of their different gendered roles, right? And then the third is, how am I, what I'm doing, differently impacted because of their different roles? And that third question is really, I think, the important one, because that's where you get the participatory engagement, right? That's where you get the feedback loop that doesn't exist in any other policy making.
Well, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Look forward to the next time you'll be back with us.
Oh, I'd love to. All right. Well, have a great day, everyone, or evening or afternoon. And thank you so much for spending time with me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.